Welcome everyone to the PathCheck Dice Global Health Innovators Talk Series. Here we discuss about crowdsourced computational health solutions. To know more about PathCheck and Dice, please visit pathcheck.org and dice.pathcheck.org. And if you're interested to join our research-based volunteer group, please head out to tiny.cc/PathCheck Slack. And if you want to visit the previous talks done in this series, please visit tiny.cc/PCF Research Talks. And with this, I would like to thank and introduce my co-organizers, without whom this would not have been possible. Ramesh Raskar, Nisi Hudson, Pradesh Sethi, and Nina Rasik. Thanks a lot for helping in putting together this amazing series. And just an introduction about the Global Health Innovators Talk Series. We plan research meetups between speakers who are creating an impact in the digital health using AI, technology, and software. And the primary motivation for this talk series is to drive collaborations in AI for health, which is primarily cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary, so that we can get the best of computer science, medicine, bioinformatics, and more. With that, we have a wonderful speaker today, Professor Alicia Red-Miles from Max Planck. So Professor Red-Miles is a faculty member and research group leader of the Safety and Society Group at Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. She serves as a consultant and researcher at multiple institutions, including Microsoft Research and Facebook. Dr. Red-Miles uses computational, economic, and social science methods to understand users' security, privacy, and online safety-related decision-making processes. Her work has been featured in popular press publications such as the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Scientific America, Wired, Business Insider, Shinier on Security, and CNET, and has been recognized with multiple Distinguished Paper Award at the USNIC Security, as well as the John Carrat Usable Privacy and Security Research Award. With that, I'd like to once again welcome Professor Red-Miles, and the stage is completely yours.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. So today I would like to talk about how we get people to adopt contact tracing apps and how we do so in a way that's ethical and respects their preferences. So in general, when we think about computational problems, these problems require constant decision-making, right? So if we think about kind of machine learning classifiers that are increasingly making a number of decisions in our lives, like whether we get a loan or who to release on bail, we have to make decisions about what features are fair to use in those classifiers. Similarly, when people are going to develop COVID-19 contact tracing apps, they also had to think about what data should be used in those apps and which features should be prioritized in getting these things out the door quickly. And typically it's experts, whether those are public health experts or computer scientists, who are setting these best practices and making these decisions. And research shows that the way that experts make these decisions is that they trade off the costs and benefits. So the diagram I'm showing here is a description that a set of researchers used to describe how they made a decision about whether or not to release a particular data set. So they were studying some issues around health and families, and they said, well, you know, if we release this data set, there's a benefit to public health, but there's also risk to individuals in the data set. And so they said, well, we kind of made a normative decision about where we thought we fell on that trade-off in order to decide whether or not to release that data. And similarly for other kinds of things like, you know, the accuracy of a classifier versus the unfairness of including certain features, we might make a similar trade-off. And again, we might do the same thing for deciding what data to use in a COVID app versus, you know, how much that data will risk people's identity, but also improve public health outcomes. Now, one of the troubles that comes up is that the way that we as experts make these trade-offs doesn't always align with how users think about things. And so the folks who are giving up their data or using certain apps might have different preferences for how they think those trade-offs should be made. And this sort of tension between what normatively experts might prescribe and what end users or just the population might want to happen is something that's been a tension even before we came into this digital era. And moral philosophers talk about this in terms of setting rules for societies. And they say, well, you can take a normative approach or a descriptive approach. And in a descriptive approach, we're going to try to learn from non-experts' preferences and behavior, and we're going to infer best practices based on what people naturally do or tell us they want to happen, as opposed to just relying on our own expertise. And of course, we don't have to go 100% with one method or the other. We may find that in certain cases, we need to sort of achieve a balance between the two approaches. And so in today's brief talk, I'm going to discuss how we can try to use descriptive ethics approaches to try to align technology with people's values, particularly in the contact tracing setting. And the reason contact tracing apps are potentially a good application of this kind of technique is that, of course, adoption matters, and the benefit of these apps scales exponentially with the number of users. And the chart that I have on the slide, right, is from this study from Oxford University that got a lot of traction, showing how much different amounts of app usage is simulated to impact daily cases. And so when we care about getting people to adopt, one of the things we can do is we can kind of try to go directly to them and infer from their behavior and what they tell us how best to get them to adopt. And at the start of the pandemic, right, experts were very focused on ensuring that apps protected privacy, right? There was lots of news about this. There was lots of development. Cryptographers were working very hard. Everyone was working hard to protect folks' privacy. But as most of us know, people don't adopt apps just because they're private. That might be one of the conditions, but it's usually not the entire story. And so we wanted to understand, why might people adopt or not adopt these apps? And in order to do this, and we were doing this around March and April of 2020, right? There were not any apps kind of out in the world. We were like, okay, well, we need to just go and ask people. And we used a combination of open and closed answer questions to try to assess what the factors were that would impact people's willingness to install. And we conducted surveys that are called panel surveys, where we try to get a representative sample of the US. And we use all these different quotas in order to do that. And the idea is that if you have a wide enough, large enough population, you should be able to sample most of the possible opinions, right? And at a high level, what we find is that privacy is absolutely one of the adoption considerations that people have, but it's not the whole story. They also care about the benefits, either to them as an individual or to society. They care about who's providing the app. They care about what it might cost them, how it would affect their battery life, or how it would affect their mobile data usage. They care about accuracy. This was something that was not necessarily being talked about a lot. On the adoption side, right? Public health folks were worried about this, but less so a conversation around end users. And then they care related to privacy about sort of security and agency. Now, we can tabulate all of these different considerations people might have, but if we want to kind of do an intervention, or we want to prioritize what we need to focus on when we're developing the apps, we need to know which of these matter the most, right? Just because people tell us they care about these things doesn't mean that we know which ones are the most impactful. And so in order to figure out which of these considerations were the most impactful, we did a number of studies. I'm just going to talk about, one of them. And one of the studies that we did is that we used what are called conjoint analyses. These are something that came out of quantitative marketing. They were traditionally used when, say, Samsung wants to release a new TV and they want to know like what colors to release it in and how much people are going to be willing to pay for it, et cetera. And so they would offer consumers options where they'd say, here's two different TVs, here are the different characteristics of them, tell me which one you want to buy, or neither. And you would have people look at a bunch of these little TV comparisons, and based on that, they'd be able to infer, okay, the most important thing to people is price, or the most important thing to people is pixels, or whatever it is. We did the same thing, but with contact tracing apps. So we said, okay, imagine it's, at this point, we knew it was going to come from a health protection agency, so we don't need to vary the provider. Let's imagine it comes from there. Both of these apps are equally popular. which one do you want? And then we gave them different variations on each of the attributes that our prior work had found were important. And what we find from doing this is that we can map out the importances of these different factors to the average American. And what we see here is that experts were exactly correct that privacy mattered. But if we were only looking at privacy as a consideration, that would only cover about 30% of what's impacting someone's decision-making process. People also care quite a bit about accuracy, just as much as they do about privacy, right? They want this thing to work if they're going to give their data to it and they're going to use it. They also care about costs, right? How much mobile data it's using, the battery life. And finally, they do care about the benefits. And what I mean by benefits is like what they think is going to, be delivered to them, and whether it's framed as being about them as an individual or about society. And when I present those findings, right, and I say this is the average American, I mean, this is sort of when we look at the population overall. Now, different groups rate different ones of these aspects more or less importance. And so just as a few sort of highlights, right, we saw that Democrats cared more about the accuracy, Republicans more about privacy. This aligns with literature that shows that Republicans in general care more about their data privacy. Younger adults cared more about benefits and accuracy, older adults about privacy and mobile costs, etc. So we see some differences. And these nuances matter because if I'm in a state where I care the most about my older Republican constituents, the way that I message about my app or what kind of app design I want or what I focus on might be influenced by what those folks care about the most. Okay, and so to that end, we actually put these kinds of results in practice to try to tailor the marketing of COVID-19 apps in multiple different jurisdictions, right? So it's lovely that we did all of these surveys, we did these experiments, but like what happens in practice? Do we see the same things? And can we use this to improve adoption? And so the study that I will talk about here where we did this was one in which we worked with the state of Louisiana. So the state of Louisiana has a COVID app that was developed by the PathCheck Foundation. This is called COVID Defense. And we worked with them on effectively advertising their COVID app. And in order to do that, what we did was we actually ran their Google Ads display ads campaign. So display ads are the ones that if you were to do a Google search, those are the ads you would see when you do Google searches. And we ran about $10,000 worth of these ads. So this was a 1-month campaign for the state of Louisiana. And when we ran this campaign, what we did was we wanted to conduct an experiment to figure out, which combination of statements that we had the knowledge to make were going to be most effective at getting people to adopt. So as I had just mentioned, right, one of the things that's very important to people is accuracy. Unfortunately, at this time, right, the app had not been released. We didn't know how accurate it was. And so we didn't have an accuracy statement. But what we did know was we knew the privacy of the app, and we knew, of course, the benefits that are true of every COVID app. And there's two different kinds of benefits, right? There's the individual benefit, which is that you get notified of your COVID exposure. And then there's the societal benefit, which is that by using the app, you can reduce COVID infections. And so one of the open questions that was true, not just in our own work, but also in policy guidance around various different kinds of pro-social behaviors for COVID-19 was, is it better to appeal to individual or collective good? And so we wanted to test that. So we ran 7 ads that had individual good appeals and 7 ads that had collective good appeals. The next thing we wanted to vary was, okay, people care about privacy. How can we best describe the privacy protections in place, given the character limitations on ads? And how does describing those protections improve or not improve people's willingness to adopt? And so we had 3 different privacy messages. So we had something broad, it just said without harming your privacy. We had something that talked about control. You control the data that you share. And then we had one that was more technical. The app data stays on your device. And finally, we wanted to try one where we don't bring up privacy at all. Because there's literature that says, well, sometimes people, when they're concerned about privacy, they actually don't want the salience of those concerns raised. And in this case, we know that the apps are very privacy protective, so we're not necessarily doing anything unethical by not mentioning. Finally, people care about the data collection of these apps. And so we had two different variants, one where we didn't mention the data collection, and one where we said the app uses information about who you have been near. And we only mentioned what data is used when we had a privacy statement, because of course we're running these ads in the real world, and we felt that if we gave the appeal and told them what data it was collecting, but not how that data was protected, we would be artificially reducing people's likelihood to install. So that was not, the data collection was only mentioned with the privacy statements. Okay. So we ran all of these ads, and we looked at the click-through rate of people clicking on the ad, which took them to the page to download the app. And what we find is that in the state of Louisiana, the collective good appeal was significantly more effective at encouraging adoption. And there's a couple of hypotheses for this. So one is that, and I apologize, the text is switched. Collective good appeal is reduced COVID cases, and individual good is get notified of COVID exposure. So reduced COVID cases is more effective. One hypothesis for that is that we're being most honest in that way about the highest impact of the app. This is the thing it's going to do best. The other hypothesis for this is that at least in 2004, which is the last time this was measured, Louisiana was the most collectivist state in the United States. And so among folks who are collectivists, there tends to be a very high desire to protect other members of the in-group. And so messaging that made folks feel like they were protecting other folks in Louisiana might have been especially appealing. Okay. Now, the second thing we see is that the impact of the privacy statements varies depending on which appeal was used. So when the ads or the app was framed as being for the collective good, then mentioning things about privacy improved people's willingness to adopt. And it didn't matter which privacy statement we used, all of them made people more likely to adopt. And one possible reason for this is that when people are thinking about giving up data for the benefit of others, they tend to be extra concerned about their individual privacy. And so these reassuring statements may have lowered that while they were still kind of thinking about how much good they were doing for society. On the other hand, if we presented the app as an individual good, the privacy statements either had no impact, or in the case of the technical statement, had a negative impact, made people less likely to install. And one of the hypotheses for this is that people do something called privacy calculus when they're thinking about individual benefits and individual privacy, where they try to decide if the privacy risk is sort of worth the individual benefit. And when we raise the salience of that privacy risk by talking about privacy more, especially in a technical way, we may have sort of thrown off balance their privacy calculus. And that's what we think is going on with this technical privacy statement. Now, the final piece is data transparency, where we actually see opposite effects. When we tell people about what data is being used, in the collective good case, they become less likely to install. And this may be kind of a similar salience effect. I'm focused on how much I am helping the population. Okay, you reassured me a little bit about my privacy, great. But now you're reminding me how much data I'm giving up. Oh boy, I don't know if I feel good about that. In the individual case, being transparent about the data actually helps, because I'm already doing that privacy calculus, and I may have sort of overthought about what data I'd have to give up. And so you're kind of scoping my fears, right? Oh, I'm only giving up information about who I've been near. Maybe that's kind of better than I was already worrying about. And so we see that the way that we frame it actually has a lot of impact about what's raised to salience in people's minds, and the other pieces of these messages then have an impact. And so what that means is, even if we were to go into super individualistic setting where the individual good appeal was more effective, we want to take care with how we're presenting the other pieces of this message. Okay, so to wrap that up, being responsible about data use is about more than just privacy, right? It's about providing technology that respects people's preferences, that is sufficiently effective, that is transparent, but in a way that sort of meshes with people's existing preferences and the way that they behave and do calculus and think about these kinds of decisions. And so as we kind of move forward in this public health space, we want to be thinking about how we kind of comprehensively are responsible and respectful around people's data and are offering them sort of the functionality that they are looking for and that provides the public health benefits that they're hoping to help achieve, as well as respecting their individual privacy. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor Brittmans. It was a great talk. So I guess I can start with a question while others are like sort of typing in. So one thing I was having is, like, you'd initially shown how different demographics or different age groups sort of preferred one over the other. They were more concerned about privacy. They were more concerned about data. So for doing those sort of surveys, like, how did you sort of select the group that you want to survey from? Like, was it completely random, or was there some sort of algorithm behind selecting the cohort?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the survey where I had showed, I don't want to go back to that slide, those results, this was from a survey of, I believe it was about 4,000 folks in the US, and the demographics of those folks matched the US Census within about 5%. So this would have been across like all geographies in the US, and age, race, education, et cetera. Those quantities would have been within 5%. Now, one thing that these kind of online surveys, they have two biases, right? So one is that there are folks in the US who do not have consistent internet access, right? They get internet by going to the library, et cetera. There are ways that you can survey those folks, but we were not using a survey panel that does that. So we would not have included those people in our sample. Now, in some ways, because we're interested in mobile phone apps, that's like kind of okay, because we're likely not talking about folks who don't have mobile phones. The other bias, of course, is that these are folks who are willing to take online surveys, and there's certainly kind of systematic non-response in that some folks are not willing to take those kind of surveys. So I'd say that was sort of the only selection criteria. Otherwise, we were trying to get as broad of a sample as possible. And I should have said we also tried to balance on political leaning, just given how politicized COVID is.
Right, absolutely. And another thing which I was having in mind is, when you're talking about informing the people through the ads about, like, this is the level of privacy that you're compromising on, or this is the data that you're releasing, how technical or how non-technical the language was. Like, how did you come to that? Because I can understand that there could be an entire diverse spectrum of audience who might be visiting these. So we don't know, like, whether the person would understand a purely technical, someone writes that, okay, this is a zero knowledge privacy preserving solution, like, probably that's not understandable for a large majority. So how was that sort of identified?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So we tried a number of different ways of explaining these things to folks. So for example, here you'll see for accuracy, we were saying 90 out of 100 exposures to coronavirus. The reason we are expressing things that way is that there is actually a whole field of numeracy research, a lot of which comes out of like the health risk field, where they tried to figure out, how do we explain people's risk of breast cancer to them? How do we explain risk of lung cancer if you're a smoker, et cetera? And they found that these kind of N out of M numbers were like the most effective way to explain things, because people don't really understand fractions, they don't really understand percentages, but they can kind of get these counts. And in other studies that we did where we tested this, we would actually tell people things like, if you didn't install the app, say 1 out of 100, every 100 times, a manual contract, like you would get a phone call that you've been exposed to coronavirus. if you install the app, then 5 out of 100 times you would find out that you'd been exposed to coronavirus. So sometimes we give these kind of reference events, and then we can ask people some comprehension questions afterward to see if they kind of understood what the difference was between those numbers. In terms of the privacy risk, we actually tend to do something pretty similar. So there are these big charts, and I don't think I have one in the appendix, but you will show people ranges, say 1 in 10 to 1 in 100, 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000, and there will be reference events like chance of getting a speeding ticket, chance of having your purse stolen, chance of having your house burned down by arson, these kinds of things. And you'll ask people, what do you think the chance is that your data might get leaked from a coronavirus app? And they'll like click on one of these boxes. And one of the things we find is that people actually have a sense of what they think the risk is. They also have the sense for what they think the risk that their bank account will get hacked, et cetera. And so again, you can then set their perception of the risk as higher or lower than whatever they think it is. So you can say, oh, well, you thought it was the risk of, getting your purse stolen. It's actually the risk of a speeding ticket, or it's actually the risk of you getting murdered in the next year. And they can go, oh, that's way less than I thought. So this is usually how we try to set these things. But absolutely, it's sort of a delicate balance of giving enough transparency. And sometimes we don't know those numbers, right? So a lot of times we don't know what the risk is. And so we have to figure out what's a reasonable way for us to explain these kinds of things.
Right. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So I just had one quick follow-up question. So at PathCheck, we're on the works of developing a crowdsourced solution for epidemics in general, for pandemics. And we want based on your studies on the contact tracing app and in general about adoption, what do you think are, let's say, the 1 or 2 things that we should focus most on when it comes to digital health solutions? Is it the social messaging part of it? Is it the how we deliver the technical prowess of our solution, making sure that everyone understands it's extremely privacy preserving or doesn't collect any data? What are the aspects that one should most focus on?
Yeah, I think the aspect I would focus on the most is clearly articulating what people should expect to get from participating in the solution, right? Whether that's, we expect that this will accelerate our ability to solve big health problem by 10 years or 5 years. And I don't think people are necessarily expecting you to be exactly precise. It doesn't even have to be exactly numeric, but being very clear about here is how your contribution will help. Because a lot of what we found, and I didn't talk about this so much in this talk, but people want to be good citizens and they want to feel like they're doing something good. And I think sometimes actually, and we saw this in this field study, the emphasis on individual privacy sometimes undervalues the amount of sort of social good that people want to do. And yes, they want to make sure they're not harming themselves, but they equally want to make sure that by taking on a little risk, which they are, and they know that they are, right, that they're actually getting something back. And so I think it's kind of a balance of sort of being respectful of the fact that they know that they're taking on risk. And even if you tell them there's no risk, they're not going to believe you. We actually tried that in some experiments where oh, there's no risk that anything's going to happen. And they were yeah, that's crap. There's definitely risk that something's going to happen. So I would say, be as honest and as clear about your privacy protections as possible, but equally important to make clear what the benefits are from participation.
That's awesome.
Rohan, if you don't mind, I'll just follow up. In terms of what they get, how do you convey, or is there any consideration with how you convey the value of what the outcomes may be by receiving the exposure notifications, what actions they can take, or is that sort of a minefield of politicized, dogma?
Yeah, we tried with Louisiana, we had tried some different things that were protect your loved ones and et cetera. I would say some of the questions that arise there is it has to be clear enough to people how it does that, right? And I think there was some kind of challenges occasionally for folks of whoop, if I'm already exposed, then that's it. And so I think we would have to and it may be a diagram or some things that we weren't working on that sort of makes it more clear how that individual or maybe family level protection is being offered. Because I think when it's sort of a long series of connections, then folks sort of lose the thread a little bit. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And were you able to do any kind of analysis of the use of COVID defense in Louisiana in terms of any kind of outcomes compared to other states?
I have not been able to do that. I know they were thinking about trying to evaluate efficacy, but I haven't heard whether they were able to do so. It's still on my list to kind of follow up with them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it's an ongoing case study.
Yes. Well, and it's a hard thing. I think I had talked to Apple briefly at one point, right? Which was, we worked so hard on protecting privacy, which in some ways eroded our ability to measure efficacy, right? Which is something that folks care about. And so I think there's a lot of research space to be done, even on, how do we do privacy preserving efficacy evaluations, whether that's having different phone lines where you track where the exposures came through, how people found out, et cetera. I think there's a lot of room for development there as well.
Well, Rohan, I could keep going in terms of questions, and I want to be mindful of time, but I'm curious from a technical perspective. We had Professor Milind Tambe, I think I'm saying his name correctly, a few sessions ago, talking about things like the Whittle index and using those types of techniques to determine what messaging should go out to somebody without knowing much information about them. Is anything like that being employed in what you've created here?
Yeah, so we did do some evaluation of how demographics impacted people's receptiveness to these different messages, and absolutely saw some differences. For example, in general, women were more receptive to installing COVID apps, and they were especially more receptive to the collective good appeal. Men, it varies a little bit by age, but seem to have they still preferred collective good, but like in some cases and some combinations, individual good was better. So absolutely, there is room for personalization here. And unfortunately, Google Ads does not have like political affiliation inferences. So we were not able to look at that, but I would strongly suspect that if they did, or if you were able to target ads based on kind of political inference, that would matter. The other thing I'll say is we have been looking a bit at in the study where we were looking at which are the most important aspects. We are also looking at different cohorts of people. Basically, what we see across all of our studies is there's about 20% of people who are just not going to install these apps. Like, it doesn't matter what you tell them, doesn't matter if they're perfect, it doesn't, whatever, they're just not installing them. And the reason for that is they're either like so suspicious of COVID that this is just a no, or they have kind of a practice of like not installing apps and other tech gadgets. And so they're like, yeah, I don't care what you're offering me, like, no. And then the other 80% of people fall into sort of two cohorts. One of those cohorts is people that are pretty sold on the idea. And what we find is that those people care the most about accuracy. So they're sold on the idea, but you have to convince them that your specific app is going to actually deliver on that. The people who are more on the fence, they care less about accuracy and more about privacy and the costs to themselves. And so I can absolutely see that you might be able to do some inference to figure out which group someone is in, not even bother spending money on the people who don't care. And then from the other two cohorts, kind of target different messaging depending on which the person is, or sort of slowly nudge them through their journey. Because I could see that someone who's debating, if you convince them of the privacy, they might now care about the accuracy and need sort of your next set of messaging. So I could definitely see sort of a user journey there that I haven't seen as much kind of discussion about that.
And do you see a role for exposure notification applications post-pandemic? Assuming COVID-19 finally wanes completely and is a distant memory for all of us, a year or so from now. What's the future of exposure notification from your perspective?
So I'm probably perhaps the wrong person to answer that, as I'm not a health scientist. But I would say, obviously we will still have infectious diseases, STDs, et cetera, for which, people need exposure notification. And I would actually say, as much as the apps have maybe not gained as widespread adoption as we hoped, I actually don't think that means that they're not a good idea. I think it just means that we need to iterate a little bit, right, in terms of like how well partnered they are into or integrated into our medical system, right? So we did a study with folks who were using the COVID app in Belgium, and we interviewed folks who've been using it for a year, right? And the people who kept it installed were like, yeah, I use it for exposure notification, but really I use it as a test results app. And then if I get exposed, I notify people. And that's actually not a bad thing, right? We can kind of lean into the ways that people found them useful. And I think they can absolutely be useful for other, health issues as well.
Did anyone feel like just having it installed made them feel more confident in their ability to sort of go out?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We also saw that. It reminds me of we also study these wearables that people have for if I go on a date or something and I can hit the bracelet and then police will come, that kind of thing. Similar sort of yes, little guardian angel sort of effect. We definitely saw people talking about that as well.
Yeah, and I would wonder then too, if that gets entered into the privacy calculus at some point now that we've had use of these tools, and can come up with the value of what we do with them, whether it's knowing they're there to then report when I have something, because that's part of the collective good that I want to participate in, or knowing that there's a watchdog sort of out there for me, keeping their eye on me, and that's the sort of individual good that I receive from it. And anyway, I think obviously it's sort of an ongoing discovery of value, and I would hazard to guess that at some point exposure notifications could be repurposed for other types of, obviously, other pandemics, but then also perhaps flu season and strep throat and whatever else, depending on how the major players like Google and Apple allow for the developers to leverage that technology moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one thing that we did see with the guardian angel effect, that's where we saw kind of efficacy come up a lot, where people had a sense of oh, if not enough other people have adopted, then this might not work. And we saw kind of a big difference between folks who were, say, on a college campus where adoption had been pushed a lot and they had the sense that their community, everybody had it, and so it was useful to them, versus folks who are maybe in communities with more sparse adoption and they were well, I never get the notifications, or I got one and it was wrong. And those are kind of those critical kind of trust moments that I think that's where we'll have to work on a little bit more if we want to see kind of really widespread use.
And maybe exposure notifications as a single data point to a user is not enough context. Maybe it needs to be paired with something else that adds, some more value, so that it isn't just oh, I got the one exposure notification at one time and it was meaningless for me. Or I got so many exposure notifications and I did all the things, but then still I got it was sort of a punitive effect from the school or organization that I was in. It was the same impact of a lockdown or whatever else. So,
it's a hard needle. It's a hard problem. But it's an interesting one, I think. It's very different than a lot of the technology we look at where it's okay, it's just about you. This is quite the opposite, and that makes it harder, but I think also has the benefit to be more impactful.
Thank you very much. This was an extremely thorough presentation. Rohan, I'll turn it back to you if you have anything, other final thoughts or questions.
Yeah. I guess it was really good, and it was an amazing discussion. So once again, thanks a lot for sharing this entire framework with us and all these insights from the study. And we look forward to having more interactions with you as well in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks for having